a coalition of civil society organizations has declared that the official result of Anambra elections, governorship elections released by the Independent National Electoral Commission are consistent with independently verified estimates, affirming the credibility of the electoral process. The incumbent governor, Charles Chukwuma Soludo, secured a second term in office until 2030 after he was declared the winner of the November 8 election. However, the coalition named the Anambra Election Observation Hub and comprising Yiaga and the Kuka Center, International Press Center, IPC, and Center for Media and Society, COMESU, Nigerian Women's Trust, Elect Her, TAF Africa, decried vote buying and voter apathy. Also, the coalition noted that while the polling unit opening showed improvement, less than half of the polling units were operational at the official start time, indicating that INEC still needs to address the persistent logistical challenges. So joining us to discuss the conduct of the just concluded Anambra election is Cynthia Mbamalu, Director of Programs, Yiaga Africa. Cynthia, great to have you on the program. An election where, as at the start of election time, 48% of the polling units had materials. What happened to logistics? Isn't it becoming a cultural problem with INEC? And obviously, talk us through vote buying, because EFCC said they only could apprehend 3 people. Obviously, there were more than 3 incidents for vote buying. Is this time to make a case for the Special Election Offences Commission now that we've been talking about since the Waste report came out?
Good morning once again. I think one of the things we need to begin to address, so I do believe actually, is to start calling out on INEC. When you talked about the late opening of polls, so for instance, at 8:30 a.m., which is the official time for commencement of accreditation and voting, only 26% of the polling units had commenced the process. The numbers further increased by 9:30 and then 10:30 a.m. But what we're looking at is 8:30 is the official time of commencement. We're expecting to have at least over 50% of the polling units commencing the procedure by 8:30. We celebrate that, yes, these elections, we had earlier commencement than last elections, because in the last elections, by 7:30, only 17% of polling units had materials and personnel. But at least this time around, about 49% of polling units had material and personnel present from 7:30 as they prepared to commence by 8:30. But the bigger challenge is why do we consistently deal with logistics management in our elections, especially for a state? This is just a state election. Anambra, the topography is not as difficult as some states. Yes, there are some riverine areas, but I mean, in the pre-elections phase, we already had reports of about 83 boats that would be used to support logistics management. And so we're expecting that this time around, we would exceed citizens' expectation when it comes to commencement of polls, but that is still a major challenge. And so it's a call on INEC. We cannot consistently make excuses for late commencement of polls in state elections, not to even mention the national elections. So that is on the one hand. INEC honestly needs to go back and review its plans, its strategy, leverage both logistics, training, and technology to see how we improve on deployment of materials so that voters who are at the polling unit on time would get accredited and go home and continue their lives. The other thing you talked about is the money issue. This honestly for me is a bigger call on the political class. We have a political class who obviously are not confident in their candidacy, because the only reason you deploy money to the field is because you do not trust that voters believe in you. And this is not a one-party thing. The different parties were giving out monies. Unfortunately, this time around, we saw issues around transfers. So people had POS in some locations, which is why it's not easy to even track it now. But you can see that monies are changing hands. So you didn't have a lot of cash transaction happening, because now you had electronic transfers, you had POS. You can imagine people moving about with POS. We were expecting to see a lot more arrests in the elections, but the record is not showing that high number. And so there is a bigger question on, one, our political class, their failure to even believe that democracy in itself works, because the only reason you deploy money is because you don't trust the process, you don't believe the system works, and you do not believe the voters even trust in you as a candidate. Right. And so you have politicians whose the only thing they have to offer is money at the polling units, and not promises on what they would deliver when in office.
Very well said. Thank you very much for highlighting that. On a light note, we've been talking about employing or using technology to elevate our electoral processes. It seems like it's only in vote buying that this has really worked, because they now moved to electronic transfer of money, and that's very sad. But let me go back to the question around low voters, because this has continued to be a plague, not just in Anambra State, but in other parts of the country. And what we're looking at this morning is to see, first of all, in Anambra State, traditionally or historically, voter turnout hasn't been really great. In fact, this year, 20% or 21% is said to be a lot better than the previous election when it was at 10%. First of all, what do you think were some of the reasons why the young people refused to come out to vote, despite the fact that a registered voter collection, the voter card collection was high? The percentage of people who went to collect their CVR was high. So why didn't they come out to vote? And then what can INEC do for future elections to encourage voter participation?
There is no incentive to participate. If you ask the average young person on the street, the question is, they always tell you, we don't trust our votes would count. And that is because historically they've seen a system where voters turn out to vote and then the results do not reflect the vote cast. Even though we've seen improvement in the process, but the bigger question is lack of trust. The second is the quality of governance. I mean, in Anambra, we engage in some communities, they will tell you, why should I vote when leadership does not meet my needs? I mean, governance itself has not improved my life in any way possible. And so for them, why waste my time go to vote for people who will get elected and at the end of the day the policies do not meet our daily needs? And so there is a bigger question around the poor governance, the poor state of of leadership in Nigeria across board. A lot of Nigerians are disengaging from the system. A lot of Nigerians would follow all the political conversations but do not trust that the process would work for them or that the leaders elected would actually work in their interest. And so that's a big challenge that we've saw in Anambra, and we've seen it consistently. And then the other part is when you've had a system where there are issues and you don't have a robust process for responding to citizens' grievances in the electoral process, it creates lack of confidence. And what have we seen post the 2023 elections? There were major challenges from that elections, but INEC never had a conversation with citizens, one, to explain, okay, for instance, IREF failed in presidential election. Why did it fail? There's a process of confidence building where institutions that make promises to the people and fail on those promises create an opportunity to engage these same people to explain what the issues are and to highlight the steps it will take to address it in forthcoming elections. So we don't have that open system of citizens' engagement and interaction in Nigeria, which is why there's a growing decline in trust in state institutions, not just INEC, in the National Assembly, in a lot of government institutions. Citizens no longer have trust in a lot of these institutions. Why? Because these institutions still operate from a very dictatorial point of view, where they believe that we tell you something, if we fail, don't question us because we don't want to respond to your questions. Okay. And that is a culture we need to do away with. We need institutions that when they have an issue, they can address it and engage the people differently.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insights, Cynthia. I'd just like to interrogate something, which is that Yiaga Africa, in your statement, official statement for this election, the headline is official results align with PRVT findings, PRVT being process and results verification for transparency. I'd like for you to reconcile something that's confusing me. The observers are saying that the results align with projections and with all the other processes around tracking results. But then we're saying that there was vote buying and all of these other activities that were taking place. What do we do to reconcile this? Because the security services were there, the security presence was heavy. There's reports of the ballots, the polling stations themselves being too exposed. Even the winner even showed his own, his own ballot paper. So there's issues around secrecy of the ballot as well and making it transactional. Without getting into too much detail in my question to you is, how do we reconcile all of these things beyond the bigger socio-economic issues of yes, there's poverty and there's disillusionment. But from a practical perspective, what do we need to do to intervene to make sure that this system that has now been hijacked, if I may call it that, to say that, okay, let the system work, but we'll do things outside of the system to influence the outcome. So what can be done on the outside?
Well, on the outside, honestly, is to invest in massive civic and voter education. Why? Votes are beginning to count, which is why our data show that, yes, the official result announced is a reflection of the vote cast across the polling units, and we trust our data. But the truth is the votes that are counted are the votes that are bought, because politicians understand that the system is actually working, and so they invest a lot in spending as much money as possible. And so you're having people that are duly purchased, more or less, than duly elected. And so what we're pushing for now is how do we begin to engage and educate the people to understand that the system is getting better. But the problem is with lower turnout, it's easier to buy as many votes as possible. With lower turnout, it's easier to change things you want to in a favor of who has the most money. And so moving forward, we need to invest in civic and voter education. Nigerians need to begin to value the power in their vote, value the power of choice, and making that decision in a legitimate way. And so that is the one thing, investing in civic and voter education. The second is the culture of impunity. No voter should showcase or show who they trumpeted for, not even the governor of a state or the president, because our rule is secret ballot. And so imagine if we start making arrests for even high-profile people who breach the guidelines at the polling unit. It will curb that culture. But we have a culture of impunity that is enabled by the political class. So people are not held accountable when they breach a simple rule in our electoral guideline and in our electoral act. So that is the other thing. We need to invest a lot more. I mean, the call for Electoral Offences Commission is key at this point. We need a system that can truly punish offenders in the electoral process. That is one way to curb impunity in the process and create some level of sanity in the electoral process. But the bigger question is to Nigerian people. Honestly, the process is getting better, but we just need to trust it enough to show up in our numbers. To change electoral outcome, the numbers is all that matters. So if 10 people come out and vote, and these 10 people's votes were bought, the result will still reflect the choices of these 10 people. And so the mathematics is clear. You turn out to vote, you cast your votes, what goes into the ballot is what is counted, and then we can follow it through the results collation process.
Okay, Cynthia, I want to bring forward this very important question, because I know there's a court ruling to that effect, that people should be permitted to vote even if they have their temporary voter's card. There was a lady of a 96-year-old woman that because she didn't have their permanent voter's card wasn't allowed to vote in this last election.
Okay. All right.
What's your take on that quickly? Your answer as we wrap up.
In a sentence, Cynthia, because we need to go, please. One sentence.
My take on that is for electoral reform, we need to review the Electoral Act on mandatory PVC. That is one way to solve this problem. And it's electoral reform for National Assembly.
Thank you so much, Cynthia Mbamalu from Yiaga Africa. I think a very big takeaway for me is that the system is the process is getting more efficient, but people need to be able to trust and come out in their numbers so that we see a reduction in, cooking up of results or even an opportunity to inflate the numbers. Thank you so much, and for the great work that Yiaga Africa is doing. Thank you, Cynthia.